course. I wish that yesterday the short presentation met your expectation. I know it's a very basic yesterday because you know this is the first course in Saudi Arabia about basic immunology. We meant to have it as a basic, or because we have senior residents, some junior resident fellows, so we want to give them as much as we can from the basic. Today we will still basic, but more advanced for rheumatologists. Just because of the time. Other things, I apologize because I wasn't with the subject because I have to have a meeting, important meeting about Pan-Arab Conference, so I have to meet with the other Arab societies. It was in Jordan. Inshallah, Pan-Arab Conference will be early in 2019. So we start our session today with Dr. Husam Malibary. Dr. Husam Malibary is a consultant clinical immunologist working at the Aziz University. He did his baccalaureate degree working at the Aziz University, and internal medicine was in the Royal College of Physicians of Canada. Yes, it was in Western Ontario. Then he did his fellowship in the Royal College of Physicians of Canada. After that, allergy clinical immunology in McGill University in Montreal. He obtained the Canadian Board Certificate in Allergy Clinical Immunology in 2015. Currently, Dr. Malibary is an assistant professor of medicine at King Abdulaziz University, Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. He's a consultant internist, allergist, and clinical immunologist at the university. He's the head of the Allergy and Clinical Immunology Division at King Abdulaziz University. He is also the director of the internal medicine residency program. He has several positions at the university. He is a member of several local and international societies, and he is the Secretary General of the Saudi Society of Internal Medicine. He has got several publications, conference presentation, national and international. He is going to talk about two lectures today. The first one about T-cell mediated immunity.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Dr. Rahman, for this nice presentation. I would like to thank you all for coming today. I also would like to thank the Saudi Society for Rheumatology, and in particular the Scientific Committee, for inviting me to this lovely course. I'll talk today about the adaptive immune response in general, and I will divide my talk into two lectures. The first one is about the T-cell mediated immunity, and the second part is about the humoral immune response. Now, it was almost impossible to talk about the adaptive immune response within 15 minutes or so that we have, and it was even more challenging actually to prepare these slides. We know already so much about the adaptive immune system, how does it work with its two components, the cellular and the humoral response. So what I did, I tried to pick the main concepts in both arms, the cellular and humoral, to present it today, and I apologize for you today. There are much details that I had to skip, so I can squeeze my talk within 25 minutes per each talk. So we'll start with the cellular immunity, or the adaptive immune, the cellular component of the adaptive immune system. So the development and function of the secondary lymphoid organs, we talk about how does the lymph node tissue is developed and how it's organized. Since the secondary lymphoid tissue is the main site where there is initiation of the adaptive immune response. I think there's something wrong here. So adaptive immune system responses are initiated in the secondary lymphoid organs. As Dr. Azam mentioned yesterday, the immune system or the lymph tissues are actually classified into primary organs, including the bone marrow, the liver, and the thymus. And there are secondary lymphoid tissues, mainly including the lymph nodes, the spleen, and the mucosal associated lymphoid tissues we call MALTs, such as the pear patches in the gut. So these are the secondary lymphoid tissues, and these are the organs where there is the initiation of the adaptive immune response. This is the site where the T cells meet their antigens and start the adaptive immune response. So we'll talk in a bit of details about these organs, how do they originate, and what's the structure of these organs. So we start with the lymph node. This is the classic structure of a standard lymph node. So the lymph node is composed of 4 components. It has the capsule, so this is the capsule, basically the outer connective tissue layer. Beneath that is a subcapsular sinus, which is this tiny space, and then there is the cortex, and the cortex is divided into 2 parts. The outer part of the cortex is the outer zone, or the B-cell zone, where there are the germinal centers for the B cells, and the inner part of the cortex, which is the T-cell zone. So most of the T cells are actually located in this zone, and then eventually the medulla, where the lymph drains here. The lymph comes through the afferent lymph vessel, and then leaves through the efferent lymph vessel. There's also the circulation that supplies blood to the lymph node. So normally the antigen delivered to the lymph node either freely flowing through the lymph, or presented by or loaded on the dendritic cell, and then presented through the afferent lymph node, through the sinuses, and then delivered to the T cells and B cell. On the other hand, T cells and B cells are actually circulated in the circulation, and then they appear through what we call high endothelial venules, or HEV or HEV, where they extravasate from these venules and then locate either to T cell or B cell zone. The spleen is another major secondary lymphoid tissue. So the structure of the spleen also, it has four parts. It has the white bulb, this area, which also divided into T cells and B cell. So the T cell basically surrounds the central arteriole. It's called the pars or periarteriolar lymphoid sheath. And there is the B zone, which is the B cell follicles surrounding the central arteriole. There is the red bulb, which supports the white bulb. It's actually surrounding this area. It mostly contains monocytes, macrophages. There is the vascular system that supplies blood to the spleen, and there is the supportive connective tissue of the spleen as well. Same idea here, but the difference is that antigens and lymphocytes are both delivered to the spleen through the blood supply. So there is no lymph fluid to the spleen, as in lymph nodes. So the antigens are actually presented either free floating or even loaded with dendritic cells. They reach the marginal sinus, and then from there they diffuse into T cells and B cell zone to activate naive cells there. T cells and B cells also delivered through the same central arteriole, reaching the marginal sinus, and then diffuse. So B cells go to the B cell zone, here, and T cells go to the T cell zone, waiting for their antigens or looking for their antigens to get activated. Regarding the multi-tissue or mucosa-activated lymphoid tissue, kind of similar idea. So this is the epithelium of the gut. This is the lumen of the gut. Again, my colleagues talked about this briefly. So the structure basically includes subcutaneous or subepithelial lymphoid tissue. So the antigen is delivered through the lumen, and then is transferred through specialized cells called M cells or microfold cells. These cells take up the antigen or bacteria, and then transmit it to subepithelial lymph node. Here, there are resting dendritic cells waiting for these antigens. They capture it, and they present it to the local naive T cells. Local naive T cells, again, delivered through the high endothelial venules or HEV, and they are looking for their dendritic antigens with specific loaded dendritic cells with specific antigens. If the dendritic cell did not find its lymphocyte with the same specificity, it will be drained through the lymphatics to the lymph nodes, looking for T cells that are specific for this particular antigen. So overall, all 3 structures have similar concept. T cells are delivered to the lymph node, and antigen is delivered to the lymph node through D cells, dendritic cells, or even freely. So that's why the secondary lymphoid tissues are thought about as crossroads for antigens and for T cells to meet. Why is this important? Because we only have few specific T cells and few B cells that recognize particular antigen. For example, Staph aureus antigen, there are only few cells that can recognize T cell. So in order for these T cells to recognize a Staph antigen, we should have a mechanism that enhances their meeting. If you leave it for chance, it will be very low chance for a T cell, circulating T cell, to meet a circulating floating Staph aureus. That's why we have this mechanism that enhances the chance of specific T cell that meets a specific antigen in a specific site, which is a secondary lymphoid tissue. So how do lymphocytes distribute through secondary lymphoid tissue? As I mentioned, there are specific areas for T cells and there are specific areas for B cells. So how do lymphocytes know where to go? This is basically through the chemokine mechanism. So T cells and B cells are partitioned, as I said, in distinct regions in the secondary lymphoid tissue, as we saw. And this depends on the cytokines produced by the stromal cells of each zone. So T zone produces cytokines or chemokines that attract T cells, and B zone stromal cells produce cytokines that attract B cells. Follicular dendritic cells within B cells follicles produce CXCL13, which is the chemoattractant for the CXCR5 expressed by the B cells. So that's how B cells migrate from the circulation and localize in the B cell zone, depending on the expression.
Molecule. The S1P molecule is usually expressed in the blood more than its presentation in the lymph tissue. And T cells have receptors for S1P. So once they reach the lymph node, after a few minutes or a few hours, they discover there is not much S1P, so they're attracted towards this receptor and they egress or exit the lymph node. This molecule actually, I think it's of importance to rheumatologists because I think there are new research molecules that actually block the S1P monoclonal antibodies against this molecule, so S1P. So this helps retaining lymphocytes inside the lymph nodes, so the lymph nodes cannot actually exit the lymph node, so decrease the autoimmunity produced by this lymph nodes. I'm not sure if it's actually approved for anything. I think it's approved for multiple sclerosis, the S1P inhibitor molecule. So antigen presentation by dendritic cells. Tissue dendritic cells take up and present antigens into the MHC molecules that we saw. Now T cell dendritic cells not only present antigens, but they also present co-stimulatory molecules. So the T cell needs antigen presented to it through MHC molecule, but they also need co-stimulatory molecules to be activated. In the lymph node, these T cells present antigen to naive T cells and prime them to divide and mature into effector cells that re-enter the circulation, as we mentioned. So dendritic cells are actually considered the most professional antigen-presenting cells. However, their other cells are also considered as antigen-presenting cells. These are mainly macrophages and B cells. They can also actually uptake antigen, process it, and present it for T cells. However, these antigen-presenting cells, macrophages and B cells, don't actually activate naive T cells. They activate T cells that have already been activated by dendritic cells. So they cannot actually activate naive T cells that. So let's talk a little bit about antigen-presenting cells. So as we said, dendritic cells take up the antigen, process it, and present it to the MHC, to the T cell through MHC molecules, and they express stimulating co-stimulatory molecules. T cells also specialize, as we said, in processing and presenting soluble antigens, whereas macrophages present antigens from intracellular pathogens. So macrophage engulf the pathogen, process it, and present it on its MHC2 molecules. As I said, B cells and macrophages only stimulate effector T cells, not naive T cells. So this is how the dendritic cell actually take antigens and process it. Dendritic cells, as we said, it's the most professional antigen-presenting cell. So it has several mechanisms how it does that. It can actually uptake the antigen through its receptor, engulf it. It can actually do macrocytosis, macrogranulocytosis, which is receptor non-specific. So even if it did not have that specific receptor to that pathogen, it actually can engulf it and then process it and then present it on MHC2 molecule. If the dendritic cell get infected with the virus itself, so you can see here, the pathogen here is contained with the vesicle. So that means the cell is not yet infected. It can present it and present an MHC molecule, and it gets help from CD4. However, if the pathogen presents in the free cytosol, that means the cell is actually infected. So it will also be processed, but it will be presented this time through MHC class 1 or CD8 to be killed. Microbe-induced toll-like receptor signaling in tissue lymphatic cells induce their migration to lymphoid organs and enhance antigen presentation. So the same concept, how does the lymphocytes reach the lymph node? The dendritic cells follow the same concept. It has the same receptors, CCR7 on dendritic cells, which is attracted to CCL21 that is produced in the T zone of the lymphocytes. And that's how the T cells and the dendritic cells meet in the same site in dendritic cells, so they present antigen to each other. As I said, the antigen presentation by dendritic cells not only present antigen, but they also present co-stimulating molecules, namely the B7 family, B7-1 and B7-2, which is CD80 and CD86. These are important molecules to stimulate the T cell. They're essential for stimulation of naive T cells. It's not the antigen itself. It's not enough by itself to stimulate the T cell. Macrophages, as we said, they're also antigen-presenting cells. So I think I'm going to skip this since we talked about it for time's sake. The same process, the macrophage engulf the pathogens through phagocytosis, process the antigen and present it through MHC molecule, MHC class 2. They also present co-stimulating molecules, they activate T cells. Now the macrophage activate T cells to get help from the T cells itself. So macrophage activate T cells, the T cells will produce interferon gamma that helps the macrophage itself to enhance its phagocytic effect. B cells do the same thing. So B cells stimulate the T cell, so the T cell can stimulate the B cell back to produce antibodies. B cells, as talked, highly efficient in presenting antigens that bind to their surface immunoglobulins. So you can see the B cell receptor, which is the immunoglobulin. The B cell receptor catches free antigens into cytosol, process it, and present it on MHC molecules to T cells. But the effective T cells, not the naive T cells. And this is a two-way help, as we say. The T cell will help the B cell to produce antibodies. Priming with naive T cells by pathogen-activated dendritic cells. So now the T cells and T cells are met. What happens next in the T cells? How does the T cell activate the B cell? Actually, how dendritic cells activate the T cells? So we talked about the adhesion molecules. We said adhesion molecules are helpful in binding between lymphocytes and Atheneum. Now we talk about adhesion molecules and their role in binding T cell to antigen-presenting cells, so cell-to-cell interaction. The same adhesion molecules described before, the integrins and selectins, are involved in this process. Antigen-presenting cells deliver multiple signals for the clonal expansion and differentiation of naive T cells. This is the multiple step activation that we talked about, that the antigen-presenting cell has to do to activate the T cell. It's not only the antigen presentation is the first signal that activates the T lymphocytes. The second signal is the co-stimulation, and the two most important molecules that we talked about, B7-1 and B7-2, they stimulate the CD28 receptor on the T cell. And the third signal is the chemokines or cytokines that are produced by the antigen-presenting cell, and these cytokines in particular help differentiation of the naive T cell. So the first two signals help proliferation of naive T cell into several progenies, and then the cytokines produced by the stimulating cell help differentiating the naive T cell into one of the subsets that we'll talk about. So it will lead the T cell to differentiate into CD4 or CD8 or the different subset of CD4, such as Th1 or Th2. It depends on the cytokines produced here. Now this is very important concept in immune tolerance. Why do we need several signals to stimulate the T cell? Stimulation of T cells is actually a very powerful mechanism and lead to devastating mechanisms. And you need to have tight control of this mechanism. If we don't have these three steps, T cells will be easily stimulated. And what happens if T cell is stimulated? This is more prone to have more autoimmune disease. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala developed these several mechanisms that are all actually required to stimulate T cell to avoid autoimmunity. co-stimulation is actually more complex. We mentioned the most important components, which is basically B7-1 and B7-2, but as you can see, there are lots of co-stimulation molecules that are expressed by antigen-presenting cell that stimulate T-cell. Now, some of them are actually stimulatory molecules, whereas some of them are actually inhibitory molecules. So engagement of inhibitory molecules actually induce negative signal to the T-cell. It induces T-cell to go through energy rather than activation. I think we'll talk about this in more details in the next few slides. So this is the CTLA-4. It's also a receptor for the co-stimulation. However, engagement of CTLA-4 induces inhibition rather than activation of T-cell. The ligand of CTLA-4 is the same molecule B7, which is the ligand for CD28. So there is one molecule that have present antigens from the infecting organism on MHC class 1 molecule, and these are recognized by the cytotoxic T-cell, and then cytotoxic T-cell produce its effect on the target cell and induce apoptosis. We'll talk about this in details. Now, the dendritic cells can sufficiently activate CD8 to produce IL-2, which stimulates CD8 and so on. However, CD8 also requires co-stimulation, such as same as CD4. So where does this co-stimulation comes from? It comes from the antigen-presenting cell again. So B7 expressed by the dendritic cells. See, this is the antigen-presenting cell. This is B7. So first antigen-presenting cell produces the molecule to T-cell and also produces the co-stimulation through CD40 and through the B-cell molecule. This stimulates the T-cell. The T-cell stimulates back the antigen-presenting cell, and this helps the antigen-presenting cell to stimulate the CD8. At the same time, the antigen-presenting cell stimulates the T-cell to produce IL-2, which helps the cytokine, the CD8, to get activated. So as for the CD4, CD8 also requires co-stimulation. It does not get activated only through the antigen by itself. Let's talk about the subtypes of CD4 T-cells. As we mentioned, there are several subtypes of CD4. The ones that are most recognized are Th1, Th2, Th17, T follicular helper T-cells, and Tregs. These are all CD4, but they have different functions according to their cytokines produced mainly. So they're defined on the basis of different combination of cytokines they secrete, so they have totally different roles in the immune system based on their cytokines. Eventually, in the immune response, so during the initial phase of the immune response, naive T cells usually differentiate into effector cells, and usually most of these types are actually proliferate initially. However, as the immune response continues, one of these main types will proliferate and become the main player in the immune response. What type of that, which type of T cells is actually determined by the type of infection, by the type of process that actually stimulated the immune response. So, for example, if we have an intracellular infection, a viral infection, cytokines produced actually lead the differentiation of many T cells towards Th1. If we have a bacterial infection, extracellular, usually the cytokines produced within the infected tissue directs the differentiation of naive T cells into Th17, because Th17 is involved in the stimulation of B cells and producing antibodies, and it's also important in stimulation of neutrophils. If you have allergic mechanism, for example, this helps to differentiating Th2 response, leading to allergic reaction. Parasitic infection also stimulates Th2 to induce mast cell and eosinophils for parasitic antimicrobial effect. So this diagram summarizes the 4 or the 5 different types of CD4. This is Th1, Th2, Th17, Tregs, and T follicular helper cells. I'm not going to go in details. However, these T cells, as I mentioned, they differ in the cytokines they produce. So Th1 produces interferon gamma. This is important for intracellular infections. It helps macrophages to gain more phagocytic function. Th2 response, as I mentioned, they produce IL-4, 5, and IL-15. Th2 response important for helminthic or parasitic infections, as they stimulate eosinophils, basophils, and mast cells to produce the granules that help in killing these pathogens. T17, they produce IL-17, IL-22. IL-17 is important to recruit neutrophils to the site of infection, so T17 particularly important for extracellular organisms. T follicular helper cells, these are specialized T cells that particularly help B cells to produce this infection. So they're very important in maturation of B cells and production of antibodies and other processes such as class switching and hyperstimulation, as we'll see in the next part of the lecture. Tregs, as we said, Tregs are important in controlling the immune system, so it actually has negative effect. It inhibits the other immune cells. We talked about that. What pathway defines what particular subsets? It depends on the cytokines produced during the local environment of the infection, based on the type of infection that we gain. This is the same concept. These are the cytokines that are produced during different types of infection, and according to the cytokine produced in the local site, a specific subtype is actually produced and predominant. So not only the cytokines produced by the local infection, these T cells actually produce cytokines that control the regulation of the other subsets. So each subset, as it starts to proliferate, it produces cytokines that actually have inhibitory effect on the other cells. So Th2, if it starts to proliferate, it produces cytokines that inhibits the proliferation of Th1 and Th17. So more of the naive T cells will be differentiated in this type. Same thing for Tregs, same thing with Th1. So if one of them starts to proliferate, it produces cytokines that inhibit proliferation of other types. So you have the most appropriate subtype of lymphocyte according to the type of infection. How does Tregs control adaptive immune responses? As we mentioned, Tregs are important to induce immune tolerance. I think there is a lecture about immune tolerance later on, so I'm not going to go in details. There are two types of Tregs: the natural Tregs that usually develops in the thymus early in life, and there is the induced Tregs that are actually produced in the peripheral tissue, and these are very important Tregs that control the infection process, it controls the immune process as the infection subsides. You need to have a system to control the immune system, to control the immune response after the infection subsides, and induced Tregs is the main player to regulate or control the immune system there. Tregs are actually CD4 positive. It's a subset of the CD4 and express CD25, the main identifying molecule of Tregs. They also produce other molecules, CD60, 62 ligand, and CTLA4, which induce their inhibitory effect. So this is the concept we talked about. This is how Tregs actually inhibit the immune response. It does that through several mechanisms. One of the mechanisms is through CTLA4. Now, as I mentioned, CTLA4 is a complex or a molecule in the Tregs, and it binds to the co-stimulatory molecule B7, or expressed by the antigen-presenting cell. Here, an example is the dendritic cell. Now, what's specific about CTLA is actually more potent than the receptor of the B7 on the effector cell. As we mentioned before, the effector T cell or the naive T cell requires co-stimulation by B cell or B7 molecules. But the CTLA4 has more affinity. It actually has 20 times more affinity compared to the receptor of T cells. So Tregs actually can bind to B7 molecule. It actually can physically remove the B7 molecule from the antigen-presenting cell. So the antigen-presenting cell lose their ability to stimulate the effector cells, and that's mainly how Tregs actually suppress the immune receptor. It actually removes the co-stimulation capability of antigen-presenting cell. Not only that, Tregs also produce cytokines that actually has direct inhibitory effect on the effector T cells, such as IL-10 and TGF-beta. These cytokines inhibit the effector T cells. It also inhibits dendritic T cells. They render dendritic cells into inactive. It stimulates dendritic cells to engulf their co-stimulatory molecules, so they cannot activate T cells anymore. A third mechanism, T regulatory lymphocytes actually have receptors for IL-2. And this receptor is actually have higher affinity than the IL-2 receptors on effector T cells. So they compete for IL-2 compared to the effector T cells. They actually uptake the IL-2 receptor, IL-2 cytokine, so there is no cytokines for the T cell to develop, and that's how the Tregs, the third mechanism, how Tregs actually control the immune response and control the effect of the T cells. Okay, immunological synapse. So what's an immunological synapse? Now once the T cell get affected or get stimulated, it attaches to its target cell to perform its effect, whether being releasing cytokines or stimulating the cell to go through apoptosis or several other effectors. In order to have this, we need to form immunological synapse. So immunological synapse is actually the space performed between two cells to perform their effective functions. How does the immunological synapse perform? It's also performed through the interaction between the adhesion molecules of the two cells. As we mentioned, we talked about the integrins and their ICAMs. So these are the first molecules that bind into the surface. Now, the first interaction between these two cells is actually transient. So naive T cells will interact with the antigen-presenting cell, and the initial interaction is transient. If they don't find the MHC molecule and their antigen on the antigen-presenting cell, they leave it and they go to the next dendritic cell, screening it for its antigen. But once the antigen receptor of the T cell is engaged, because they recognize the antigen on the dendritic cells, this leads to conformational change in the integrins and lead to more potent and stable attachment of the T cells on the antigen-presenting cell. So more stimulation is delivered to the naive T cell and activating the naive T cell to become an effector cell. So this briefly describes the formation of the immunological synapse. As we mentioned, initially the antigen, the adhesion molecules bind to the receptors, formation of the synapse. Now this is important because you need to have this, especially in CD8 response. You don't want CD8 to damage all surrounding tissues, other surrounding cells. You only want T cell to damage only the infected cell. So immunological synapse allows the CD8 to produce their molecules, target molecules, towards the affected cell only. So this helps controlling the damage of CD8. So instead of damaging all other cells, the effect is only affecting the infected cell only. So that's the importance of the immunological synapse. Overall, the cytokines produced by T cells is divided into two types. The cytotoxic types, which is produced mostly by CD8. This include perforin, enzymes, kininases. These are the enzymes that produce the effector, cytotoxic effect on the T cells. These are the enzymes that actually kill the target cells. And these are the various enzymes produced by the various types of subtype CD4. I'm not going to go into details about this. It's very complicated. As you can see, actually, the same cell, one cell can produce several cytokines. And the same cytokine, such as IL-3, for example, produced by several types of T cells. So that's actually make it more complex. So this is called, for the first lecture or two? Okay. So I think I should have to skip. This is a complicated diagram, so I'm not going to go into details. But this explains the various functions of effector T cells in the immune response. Another important concept in the T cell immunity is the TNF family. TNF family is wide expressed receptors on the T cells. I mentioned this slide particularly because it's of importance to dermatologists. You guys are expert in using anti-TNF receptors. There are several forms of anti-TNF receptor monoclonal antibodies, and that have wide use in various rheumatological diseases. Why is that? Because their receptors, TNF family receptors, are expressed widely, and then many ligands can actually stimulate this receptor, leading to various immune responses. This is briefly how T-cell, cytotoxic T-cell mediates this infection is through the ligand called fast ligand, which is the death signal. Engagement of the fast ligand on the target cell induces a series of processes called the cascade series, and this eventually leads to the degradation of DNA of the cell and leading to cell death. This is briefly how cytotoxic T-cell induce apoptosis in its target cell. Again, this is a huge table that explains the various actions of cytokines produced by the various subtypes of cytotoxic T-cells. I'm just going to go quickly over this concept. So there is several types of cell death. There is a necrotic necrosis, which is cell death due to inflammation. This is a bad type of cell death because it actually stimulates local inflammation, so it damages surrounding tissue. It also allows for the spread of the infection. However, apoptosis is a programmed cell death. This happens without damaging the other tissues and actually controlling the infection. So this is the preferred way to go with cell death rather than necrosis. This is the benefit of apoptosis over necrosis. There is no spread of infection and there is no spread of inflammation to the surrounding tissue. Autophagy, I think Dr. Ali briefly talked about it before. Again, this is